My husband thought I was distracted by grief. The Panties changed the game and left me $1 million, while I was still wearing black and trying to survive the silent days after my mother's death. I seemed absent, broken, distracted by grief. That's exactly how my husband wanted me. Fragile enough not to notice his moves, his withdrawals, his lies. But amid the emotional chaos, something out of place caught my attention. A small, intimate detail, impossible to ignore. A pair of panties that weren't mine. From that moment, grief gave way to clarity. In silence, I began to observe, piece together clues, follow financial trails, and understand the game he thought I wasn't capable of seeing. He believed I was lost in pain. In reality, I was awakening. What began as betrayal ended as a turning point. And when he realized the Panties had changed everything, it was already too late. If this story helps you see through manipulation disguised as support, please leave a like and subscribe. There are predators who wait for your most vulnerable moments to strike, who see your grief not as something to protect but as an opportunity to exploit, who mistake your tears for blindness and your pain for stupidity. My husband Evan was one of those predators, though I didn't fully understand that until the weeks following my mother's funeral, when his mask of supportive spouse slipped enough to reveal the calculating opportunist beneath. This is the story of how a pair of women's underwear that didn't belong to me became the thread that unraveled Evan's entire scheme, exposing not just an affair, but an elaborate plan to steal my mother's $1 million inheritance while I was supposedly too broken by grief to notice. My name is Natalia Reyes, and I'm 36 years old. My mother Esperanza died 3 months ago at age 64, her death sudden and devastating. A massive heart attack that took her from vibrant and healthy to gone within hours, leaving no time for goodbyes or preparation or any of the rituals we use to ease the transition from having someone to losing them forever. One moment my mother existed in the world, the next she was simply absent, and that abrupt disappearance created a grief so disorienting I could barely function for weeks afterward. My mother had been a force, a successful entrepreneur who'd built a thriving catering business from nothing, who'd raised me alone after my father died when I was 8, who'd worked impossibly hard to provide not just stability, but opportunity, who'd instilled in me values of independence and strength and never accepting less than I deserved. She'd been my anchor, my confidant, my example of what women could build through determination and refusal to be limited by circumstances. Losing her felt like losing my foundation, the ground beneath my feet suddenly gone, leaving me suspended in a grief so profound I couldn't see past it. I'd been married to Evan for 6 years when my mother died, a relationship I'd believed was solid and supportive, built on mutual respect and shared ambitions. Evan worked in commercial insurance, made good money, presented as reliable and steady in ways that had seemed like strength when we met in our late 20s. Our marriage was comfortable. We both pursued careers, maintained our lives, functioned well as partners managing the practical elements of adult existence. There wasn't passionate intensity, but there was consistency, and what I'd thought was genuine affection and commitment to our partnership. Evan's relationship with my mother had been respectful, if not particularly warm. He attended family gatherings, was polite and appropriate in her presence, performed the role of acceptable son-in-law without obvious enthusiasm, but also without conflict. My mother had once commented that Evan seemed practical rather than passionate about our marriage, an observation I dismissed as her being protective and perhaps wanting more obvious devotion than Evan's reserved personality naturally expressed. In retrospect, my mother had seen something I'd missed, that Evan's commitment was transactional rather than emotional, based on what our marriage provided him rather than on genuine love for me. When my mother died, that terrible phone call from the hospital, the rush to get there, the doctors explaining there was nothing they could do, the unbearable finality of watching machines turned off and her absence become official. Evan was present in the minimal ways. He came to the hospital, sat with me during those awful hours, made some phone calls to notify people. But even in that crisis moment, I felt him emotionally distant, going through expected motions, but not really present in the grief, not connecting with the devastation I was experiencing. When I commented on feeling alone despite his physical presence, Evan said he was trying to be strong for me, framing his emotional absence as support rather than what it actually was, indifference. The funeral happened 4 days later, a service that drew over 200 people whose lives my mother had touched through her business, her generosity, her vibrant personality, and genuine care for others. The outpouring of grief and love from people who'd actually known my mother highlighted by contrast Evan's mechanical condolences and surface-level engagement. He stood beside me, performed appropriate behaviors, but seemed fundamentally disconnected from the emotions around him, as if attending a business obligation rather than his mother-in-law's funeral. What I remember most clearly about that day was Evan checking his phone during the service, scrolling through messages while the priest spoke about my mother's life and legacy. When I whispered angrily that he needed to put his phone away, that it was disrespectful to be checking messages during the funeral, Evan claimed he was handling work emergencies, as if his job couldn't wait 2 hours during his wife's mother's funeral. The incident was small but revealing. Even in that moment of profound loss, Evan prioritized something else over being present for me. The weeks immediately following the funeral were the darkest of my life. I couldn't work, couldn't function beyond basic survival tasks, spent days in bed or sitting numbly staring at nothing, trying to process a loss that felt impossible to integrate into any coherent understanding of my life going forward. My mother had been so central to who I was. Losing her meant losing part of my own identity, the reflection she'd provided of my best self, the unconditional love and support that had sustained me through every difficulty I'd faced. Without her, I felt untethered and purposeless, going through motions of existing without any real connection to life. Evan's response to my grief was impatient and dismissive in ways I barely registered through the fog of loss. He'd make comments about how I needed to pull myself together, how grief was normal but shouldn't be incapacitating, how I should try to get back to normal routines rather than wallowing. His complete lack of empathy or understanding about profound grief registered somewhere in my consciousness, but didn't penetrate enough to make me angry. I was too numb, too broken, to care about his inadequacy as supportive spouse. I accepted his coldness as somehow my fault, as if my grief was excessive or inappropriate rather than his response being inhumane. About 2 weeks after the funeral, while I was still barely functional, Evan started asking questions about my mother's estate. Had she left a will? Who was the executor? What assets did she have? The questions felt premature and insensitive. I was still crying multiple times a day, still struggling to accept my mother was actually gone, not ready to think about dividing up her possessions and managing her affairs. But Evan persisted, framing it as necessary practical planning, saying that estate matters needed attention regardless of my grief, that delaying would create complications and potentially cost money in unnecessary fees or taxes. "I'm not ready," I kept saying, pushing back against his pressure to engage with estate matters when I could barely manage to shower and eat. "I need time. My mother just died. I can't think about her assets and will right now." But Evan wouldn't drop it, kept bringing up the topic, kept emphasizing urgency and responsibility, kept suggesting I was being irresponsible by not dealing with practical matters promptly. The pressure was relentless and exhausting. One more thing to manage when I had no capacity for managing anything. Finally, about 3 weeks after my mother's death, I agreed to meet with her attorney to review the will and understand what needed to be done. Evan wanted to attend this meeting, said he should be there to help me process information and ask questions I might not think of in my grief-addled state. The attorney said spouses could attend estate meetings if the beneficiary wanted them present, leaving the decision to me. Something in Evan's eagerness to attend made me uncomfortable, some instinct I couldn't quite articulate, so I told him this first meeting should be just me, that I'd share everything afterward but needed to hear it privately first. Evan was visibly frustrated, but accepted the boundary. What the attorney revealed shocked me completely, reoriented my understanding of my mother's financial success and what she'd built during her lifetime. My mother's estate was worth approximately $2 million. Her catering business, which she'd sold 2 years ago when she'd decided to semi-retire, had been worth more than I'd realized. She'd received over $800,000 from the sale, had invested it wisely, and it had grown. She owned her home outright, valued at $350,000 in the current market. She had retirement accounts and savings that added another 100,000. After estate taxes and expenses, I would inherit approximately $1 million as her sole beneficiary. I sat in the attorney's office trying to process this information through the fog of grief and shock. My mother had been a millionaire. She'd built that wealth through decades of hard work, through smart business decisions, through careful management and investment of her earnings. And she'd left it all to me, her only child, with a letter the attorney handed me that expressed her hope I'd use the inheritance to build security and opportunity, to maybe start my own business or pursue dreams I'd been postponing, to honor her legacy by living boldly rather than playing it safe. Reading my mother's letter, absorbing her final words to me, her hopes for my future funded by her life's work, it broke something open in me that had been frozen in shock and grief. I sobbed in the attorney's office, great heaving cries that came from somewhere deep and painful, mourning not just my mother, but the future conversations we'd never have, the guidance she wouldn't be able to provide, the relationship that had defined so much of who I was now permanently ended. The attorney was kind, gave me space to cry, didn't rush me through the emotions or try to redirect to practical matters until I'd regained some composure. When I finally left the attorney's office hours later, I felt simultaneously devastated by the reminder of loss and awed by the gift my mother had left me. $1 million. The amount was life-changing, represented possibilities I'd never seriously considered because they'd seemed financially out of reach. But it also felt heavy with responsibility. This was my mother's legacy, the tangible result of her sacrifices and efforts, and how I used it would either honor or squander everything she'd worked for. The weight of that responsibility felt enormous, made the inheritance feel more like burden than gift, despite the obvious financial benefits. When I told Evan about the inheritance that evening, his reaction was immediate and intense in ways that cut through even my grief-numbed state. His eyes widened, his posture changed, his entire demeanor shifted to something almost predatory as he processed the information. $1 million, he repeated, his voice energized and calculating. That's incredible, Natalia. That changes everything for us. We can pay off all our debts, buy a house, invest for early retirement, maybe even quit our jobs eventually and travel. Your mother's gift is going to transform our entire future. The way he immediately claimed the inheritance as ours, the way he started planning what we would do with it before I'd even processed what it meant to me personally, made me feel sick and angry in ways that penetrated my grief. It's my inheritance, I said carefully, needing to establish that boundary clearly. Money my mother left specifically to me. I'll need time to decide what to do with it, how to honor her legacy and her hopes for my future. This isn't our money, it's mine, from my mother. Evan's expression shifted to something defensive and irritated. We're married, he said, his tone suggesting I was being ridiculous. Married people share assets and make financial decisions together. What's yours is mine, and what's mine is yours. That's literally how marriage works legally and practically. Your mother's money becomes our money the moment you inherit it. I'm not saying I'm going to control how we use it, but it's not just yours to make unilateral decisions about without considering our partnership and our shared future. The argument had surface logic. Married couples do typically share finances and pool resources. But something about Evan's immediate assumption of ownership, his insistence the money was ours, before I'd even decided what I wanted to do with it, felt like violation of both my mother's intentions and my right to steward her legacy as I saw fit. My mother left this money to me personally, I said firmly, my voice stronger than it had been in weeks. Not to us, not to our marriage, to me. And I'm going to take time to decide how to use it in ways that honor her memory and her hopes. You don't get to immediately claim ownership over my mother's life's work just because we're married. Over the following days, Evan's pressure about the inheritance intensified dramatically. He researched investment strategies, created spreadsheets showing how we could maximize the money, brought me proposals about real estate investments and early retirement planning. Every conversation became about the inheritance, what we should do with it, why waiting was financially foolish, why my emotional hesitation was costing us returns. He framed all this pressure as helpful support, as practical planning, as caring about our financial future. but it felt like relentless assault when I was still barely functioning through grief. Just one more demand when I had no capacity to meet any demands. I started noticing other changes in Evan's behavior during this period. He was on his phone constantly, always texting or taking calls in other rooms, being secretive in ways he hadn't been before. He started working late several nights a week, claiming project deadlines and client emergencies, coming home well after normal business hours. He was showering immediately when he got home these late nights, changing clothes before interacting with me, as if washing away evidence of wherever he'd actually been. His mood was strangely elevated despite his wife being deep in grief, almost energized, as if something good was happening in his life even as mine was shattered. I also noticed Evan buying new clothes, paying more attention to his appearance than usual, wearing cologne I didn't recognize. When I commented on this, he said he was trying to position himself for a promotion, that appearance mattered in client-facing roles, that investing in his professional image was strategic career management. The explanation seemed plausible, but something about it felt off. The particular attention to looking and smelling good felt less like professional presentation and more like someone trying to impress someone specific. About 6 weeks after my mother's death, something happened that cut through my grief fog and forced me to pay attention to what was actually happening in my life, rather than just existing in numb survival mode. I was doing laundry, gathering clothes from around our bedroom, when I found a small lace shopping bag tucked behind a stack of Evan's sweaters in his closet. I almost didn't look inside, almost just threw it away, assuming it was old packaging. But something, instinct maybe, or just mechanical curiosity, made me open it. Inside the bag were women's panties, expensive lace in burgundy red, definitely not mine in either style or size, with tags still attached showing they cost over $60. The brand was one I recognized from luxury boutique shops, the kind of intimate apparel purchased for special occasions or as romantic gifts, not everyday underwear. Next to the panties was a receipt showing they'd been purchased 3 days earlier, while I'd been home alone drowning in grief, and Evan had claimed to be working late. I stood there in our closet holding the bag, something shifting in my chest, grief receding slightly for the first time in weeks, replaced by cold clarity and rage. Evan had been having an affair. While I grieved my mother, while I struggled through the darkest period of my life, while I was barely functional and desperately needing support, my husband had been involved with someone else. He'd been buying her expensive lingerie, seeing her on his claimed late work nights, conducting a whole separate relationship while pretending to be my supportive partner through devastating loss. The discovery also connected to his behavior about the inheritance in ways that suddenly made terrible sense. Evan wasn't just having an affair. He was planning to use my mother's money to fund whatever future he was building with his mistress. His pressure about making the inheritance joint marital property, his insistence on immediate access and investment, his elaborate spreadsheets about our financial future, all of it was probably preparation to eventually divorce me and claim half of my mother's $1 million as marital asset, using my mother's legacy to start a new life with whoever he'd bought those burgundy panties for. For the first time in 6 weeks, the fog of grief lifted enough for me to think clearly and strategically. I was being exploited by someone who'd seen my mother's death as opportunity rather than tragedy, who'd viewed my grief as useful distraction that would prevent me from noticing his affair and his financial scheming. Evan had counted on me being too broken, too distracted by loss, too emotionally devastated to pay attention to what he was actually doing. He'd miscalculated. My mother had raised me to be stronger than that, and her legacy deserved better than being stolen by my predatory husband. I didn't confront Evan immediately about the panties or my suspicions. Instead, I began observing carefully, documenting his patterns, gathering evidence while maintaining the appearance of being lost in grief. I photographed the panties and receipt thoroughly, documenting everything, then replaced them exactly as I'd found them so Evan wouldn't know I'd discovered them. Over the next 2 weeks, I paid close attention to Evan's behavior, documented his late nights and suspicious patterns, checked our credit card statements for unusual charges I'd been too grief-stricken to notice before. What I found in those credit card statements was extensive. Charges at restaurants I didn't recognize, hotels in our city booked during hours I'd been home alone grieving, purchases at jewelry stores and boutiques that I'd never received gifts from. Evan had been spending significant money on his affair, using our joint credit card with apparent confidence that I was too distracted by my mother's death to review statements. The evidence suggested his affair had been ongoing for months, possibly starting even before my mother died, meaning he'd been deceiving me for a substantial period while I'd trusted him completely. I hired a private investigator named Marcus Chen, explained my situation and my suspicions, asked him to follow Evan and document where he was actually going on these late work nights. Marcus conducted 2 weeks of surveillance, and what he uncovered was comprehensive and damning. Evan was having an affair with a woman named Vanessa Lee, someone he worked with at his insurance company. They'd been involved for approximately 7 months based on Marcus's investigation, meaning the affair had started months before my mother's death and continued through my grief. The investigator's report included extensive photo documentation, Evan and Vanessa entering hotels together, having intimate dinners at expensive restaurants, kissing goodbye in parking structures, behaving obviously as romantic couple rather than work colleagues. Marcus had also obtained some text messages between them where they discussed my mother's inheritance explicitly. Evan had told Vanessa about the $1 million, described it as money they would eventually have access to once he convinced me to integrate it into joint accounts and then presumably eventually divorced me, splitting the marital assets that would include portion of my mother's inheritance. Reading those text messages, seeing Evan discuss my mother's money with his mistress as if it was his to claim and use, as if my grief and my inheritance were just obstacles to navigate on his way to a new life with Vanessa, it filled me with cold rage that was clarifying and motivating. Evan hadn't just betrayed me romantically while I grieved. He'd been actively plotting to steal my mother's legacy, counting on my grief to keep me distracted while he positioned himself to claim money that legally and morally belonged only to me. I consulted with a divorce attorney about my rights and options. The attorney explained that in our state, inheritance was considered separate property if kept segregated from marital funds, meaning Evan would have no claim to any of my mother's money in a divorce as long as I hadn't deposited it into joint accounts or used it for joint expenses. That was crucial information. It meant I could divorce Evan and he'd walk away with nothing from the inheritance despite his extensive scheming to access it. The attorney also explained that Evan's affair was relevant to divorce proceedings not because it affected asset division in our no-fault state, but because it could eliminate any potential spousal support claims. Someone who'd conducted an affair while plotting to steal their spouse's inheritance was extremely unlikely to receive alimony, even if income disparities existed. The combination of the inheritance being my separate property and the affair eliminating support obligations meant Evan had positioned himself to leave our marriage with essentially nothing, despite months of calculating about accessing my mother's $1 million. I prepared carefully for confrontation. I organized all evidence clearly: the panties I'd found, the investigator's comprehensive report, the text messages revealing Evan's plans, the credit card statements showing affair expenses. I made multiple copies, stored everything securely where Evan couldn't access or destroy it. I also took immediate steps to protect the inheritance, had the estate attorney transfer my mother's assets into accounts solely in my name at a bank completely separate from where Evan and I maintained joint accounts, ensuring he had absolutely no access or visibility into the inherited funds. I changed all my personal account passwords, gathered important documents and stored them at my attorney's office, prepared financially and legally to leave if necessary. I even packed a bag with essentials and left it at a friend's house, ready in case the confrontation turned volatile and I needed to leave quickly. These preparations made me feel powerful in ways I hadn't felt since my mother died. I was taking control, protecting what mattered, honoring my mother's legacy by refusing to let it be stolen. The confrontation happened on a Saturday morning, deliberately timed so Evan couldn't use work as excuse to escape. I'd spent the previous evening mentally preparing, rehearsing what I needed to say, steadying myself for the conversation that would end our marriage. When Evan woke up that morning, I was waiting in our living room with all the evidence spread out on the coffee table, ready. "We need to talk," I said when he appeared, gesturing for him to sit down. "I found something several weeks ago that changed my understanding of our marriage and what you've been doing while I've been grieving my mother." I pulled out the shopping bag with the burgundy panties, placed it on the coffee table. "These were hidden in your closet. They're not mine. I'm assuming they're for Vanessa Lee. The woman you've been having an affair with for the past 7 months. I watched Evan's face go through multiple expressions. Shock that I'd found the panties, fear that I knew about Vanessa, calculation about what I knew and how to respond. Before he could construct explanations, I continued. I hired a private investigator who's documented your affair extensively. I have photos of you with Vanessa, text messages where you discuss stealing my mother's inheritance, credit card evidence of you spending our money on your mistress while I grieved. I know everything, Evan. The affair, the lies about working late, the plan to access my mother's $1 million and eventually divorce me and take half as marital asset. I spread out the investigator's report and printed photos and text messages, creating a visual representation of Evan's betrayal and scheme. I want a divorce, I stated clearly. I've consulted with an attorney. My mother's inheritance is legally my separate property since we've kept it completely segregated from marital funds. You won't get any of it in the divorce despite all your scheming. You also won't get spousal support given your affair and you're planning to commit financial exploitation. You'll walk away with your retirement account and half our joint savings, which totals maybe $30,000. My mother's $1 million, the money you've been plotting to steal, will remain entirely mine. Evan cycled through predictable responses. First, denial, claiming the panties could be explained innocently, that his relationship with Vanessa was professional. When I presented photographic evidence of them at hotels and text messages that were undeniably romantic, he shifted to minimizing, saying it hadn't been going on long, wasn't serious, meant nothing. When I showed him Marcus's timeline proving the affair was 7 months old, he moved to justification, claiming I'd been emotionally unavailable after my mother's death, that he'd felt neglected and lonely. Your affair started before my mother died, I said coldly when he tried that approach. The investigator's timeline shows you and Vanessa were involved for 3 months before my mother's heart attack. You can't blame my grief for betrayal you started while my mother was still alive. That fact shut down his attempts at justification, left him scrambling for different approach. His final strategy was desperate negotiation combined with threats. He begged for another chance, promised to end things with Vanessa immediately, offered to attend counseling. When I remained unmoved, he shifted to threats, claiming he'd fight the divorce, that he'd argue for half the inheritance regardless of what my attorney said, that he'd make the process as expensive and painful as possible if I didn't negotiate more favorable settlement. You're welcome to try, I responded calmly, but you'll lose, and you'll waste money on attorneys in the process. The law is clear that inheritance is separate property when properly maintained, which mine has been. Your affair and your documented planning to commit financial exploitation will eliminate any sympathy a judge might otherwise have for you. You have no leverage here, Evan. You thought I was too broken by grief to notice what you were doing. You were wrong. My mother raised me to be smarter and stronger than that. I gave Evan 1 week to move out of our apartment, which was leased in my name only. During that week, we existed in hostile silence while he made arrangements and gradually accepted that I was serious. He tried a few more times to negotiate, to beg, to threaten, but I remained firm. The marriage was over. He'd betrayed me during the most vulnerable period of my life, had plotted to steal my mother's legacy, had shown me exactly who he was. There was nothing to negotiate or reconsider. The divorce took 9 months to finalize, during which Evan's attorney made every argument possible for why he should receive portion of the inheritance or substantial spousal support. My attorney systematically demolished each argument with evidence, documentation showing the inheritance had been kept completely separate, proof of Evan's affair and his planning to exploit me, demonstration that he had his own income and earning capacity that eliminated need for support. The judge ruled decisively in my favor on every point. The final settlement gave Evan his retirement account, worth about $38,000, and half of our joint savings, another $4,000 each. He received nothing from my mother's inheritance, no spousal support, no ongoing claims to any of my assets. He walked away from our 6-year marriage with approximately $42,000 total, a tiny fraction of the $1 million he'd been scheming to access and claim. The irony was savage and satisfying. Evan's greed and his carelessness about hiding evidence of his affair had resulted in him losing access to the very funds he'd spent months plotting to steal. If he'd been more careful about concealing the panties, If he hadn't left that shopping bag where I'd eventually find it, he might have maintained his deception longer. But his assumption that I was too broken by grief to notice anything, his confidence that my devastation made me blind and stupid, had made him sloppy. That sloppiness exposed everything. 9 months after the divorce finalized, I'm 36 and rebuilding my life with the security my mother intended her legacy to provide. I've used a portion of the inheritance to purchase a small house outright, something my mother always wanted me to have, a home that's truly mine that no one can take from me. I've invested the majority of the money conservatively in diversified portfolio managed by advisors my mother's attorney recommended, generating income that supplements my salary and allows me to live comfortably while the principal continues growing. I've also started a business, a catering company similar to what my mother built, honoring her entrepreneurial spirit and her success by following the path she pioneered. I'm using approximately $200,000 of the inheritance to capitalize the business properly, giving it the financial foundation to succeed without desperate scrambling for capital that undermines so many startups. My mother would be proud, I think, to see me building something in the industry where she thrived, extending her legacy through my own efforts and ambitions. Most importantly, I've emerged from the double trauma of losing my mother and discovering my husband's betrayal with clarity about what I deserve and what I won't accept. My mother raised me to be strong, independent, unwilling to tolerate exploitation or betrayal from anyone. Evan counted on my grief making me weak and blind. Instead, my mother's legacy, both the financial inheritance and the values she'd instilled, made me strong enough to protect what was mine and refuse to be victimized. The burgundy panties I found in Evan's closet, that small, careless mistake he made while confident I was too grief-stricken to notice, became the catalyst that exposed everything. That discovery jolted me out of the fog of grief just enough to pay attention, to investigate, to discover the full scope of Evan's betrayal and scheming. If I'd never found those panties, if Evan had been more careful, he might have succeeded in his plan, convincing me to integrate the inheritance into joint accounts, eventually divorcing me, claiming half my mother's $1 million as marital asset. But I did find them, and that discovery activated something in me that Evan had underestimated. My mother's strength, her refusal to be exploited, her insistence that I never accept less than I deserved. Through the darkness of grief, those values my mother had spent decades instilling guided me to protect her legacy and myself from someone who'd seen tragedy as opportunity for theft. I think my mother would be satisfied with how I handled the situation, strategically, thoroughly, effectively protecting her life's work from someone trying to steal it. She'd always been protective of me, careful about who I trusted, skeptical of people whose support seemed contingent or transactional. She might have seen through Evan earlier than I did, might have warned me about his character if she'd lived. In her absence, I had to see clearly on my own. The panties helped me see. My name is Natalia Reyes. I'm 36 years old and the sole beneficiary of my mother's $1 million legacy. My husband Evan thought my grief made me vulnerable, distracted, too broken to notice his affair or his plotting to steal my inheritance. He was wrong. The panties he carelessly hid in our closet, bought for his mistress with our money while I mourned, exposed everything. They changed the game completely. Evan left our marriage with almost nothing, while I kept every dollar my mother intended for me. The inheritance didn't just provide financial security, it proved I was my mother's daughter, strong enough to protect what mattered even through devastating loss. And that victory, more than the money itself, honors everything she taught me. Thank you for reading. If this story helped you recognize manipulation or gave you strength to protect what's yours, please like and subscribe.